introduce Professor José Manuel Núñez Seixas of the University of Munich, who will deliver a lecture today titled Iberian Galicia, Migration and Identity. Professor José Manuel Núñez Seixas is a historian specializing in contemporary history. The center of his research work includes state and peripheral nationalism in Spain and Europe and migrations. He is the author of numerous publications in Galician, English, French, Spanish, and Catalan. He worked at the University of Santiago de Compostela. He visited many European and American universities with guest lectures, and he's currently engaged in the history of modern Europe at the University of Ludwig Maximilian in Munich. Professor, I give you a voice.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maria. First of all, I'd like to thank the University of Warsaw and particularly the Center for Galician Studies at the Institute of Philology of this university for giving me the chance to address in this audience, and this particularly numerous audience. I guess you understood that I'm going to talk about Iberian Galicia, not about Ukrainian or Polish Galicia. It happens to me quite often when I explain abroad that I am Galician. Everybody tells me, "Oh, your accent is not Polish or your accent is not Ukrainian." But I can tell you that both Galicias, both former Polish, Ukrainian Galicia, and Iberian Galicia, have more in common than it may seem at first sight. Particularly, both lands were characterized in the modern period by extremely high rates of migration. To begin with a short tale, with a short story, some years ago I was invited to a Galician hour, an Iberian Galician hour, at the Ukrainian broadcast in the south of Buenos Aires, in a place called Lanús, where quite a high number of Ukrainian immigrants arrived in the 1990s and at the beginning of the 21st century for a number of reasons. And this was actually a Ukrainian broadcast led by an Argentinian of Ukrainian origin who was dressed like a Cossack. And he welcomed me and said, "Well, I'd like to welcome people from the other Galicia, and please, the floor is yours." And a person phoned while we were talking Galician from the broadcast. Someone phoned and said he was from Galicia. His accent was not very Galician. Actually, he had Polish accent. And he said, "Well, actually, I am from the other Galicia. I am from Lviv. And I met a Galician 50 years ago, simply by case, because he identified himself as Galician, so I addressed him in Ukrainian. And right? Okay. And then we started chatting. At the end, we fell in love, and we lived together for 50 years. And he was dead a couple of weeks ago. So you reminded me that there is another Galicia as well. Well, sometimes the history of Europe can be better understood from the peripheries, both from the Ukrainian, Polish, Galician periphery and from the Iberian Galician periphery. So the question of migration is not the same throughout Spain, throughout the Iberian Peninsula. Some territories and regions of the Iberian Peninsula have developed links with specific countries, particularly in Latin America, due to the persistence of strong communities of migrants, as well as to the enduring social memory of migration to Argentina, to Uruguay, to Brazil, and to Venezuela. Though there have been significant numbers of overseas migrants from almost all Spanish territories, Galicia clearly leads the lot. Until the late 1950s, most Spanish immigrants to Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil came from Galicia. we may estimate that around 50% of all Spanish immigrants, 45% of all Iberian immigrants came from Galicia alone, where Canary Islanders composed the largest portion of Spanish migrants to Venezuela, closely followed by Galicians and Asturians. These last two groups were the main ones among the Spanish migrants to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Mexico. According to different estimates, no less than 1.7 million Galicians left their country temporarily or permanently between 1836 and 1930, most of them towards America. At least 600,000 stayed at their points of destination between 1875 and 1930. Between 1941 and 1986, some 600,000 further Galicians also migrated to other points of the Iberian Peninsula, Central Europe, and America. Spanish statistics are far from being precise, and quantifying return migration and its real percentage is a further and for the moment almost irresolvable problem. Statistics used to be quite stupid, to put it simply, and they simply account passengers but not migrants. And to give you an example, my grandfather went twice to Argentina and 3 times to Cuba. According to Spanish statistics, he accounts for 5 migrants. He was, as far as I know, he was just counted for 1. Or he's just accounted for 1. Therefore, any quantitative estimate can be more or less reliable, but we are unable to offer undisputable figures. Anyway, there is no doubt that if considered as an independent country in statistical terms, Galicia could be placed among the European countries characterized by the highest rates of immigration in the period of mass migration. This is between 1850 and 1930, between the top 1, which is Ireland, and the top 2, which is Italy. I have to say Poland is top 5, which is not bad. At least the lands of partition Poland, the lands of historic Poland before independence in 1918. Migration deeply affected all aspects of Galician life and became a powerful conditioning factor of Galician society, economy, and socio-political evolution. It was constantly repeated by contemporary observers since the 19th century that Galicia could not be understood without migration. And this is true. Like many stereotypes, it has a real basis. It has at least a more or less realistic fundament. It is almost impossible to tally the total amount of Galicians who live outside the modern country at the beginning of the 21st century. Taking into account only migrants who were born in Galicia, but not their children or grandchildren, official data estimated that in 1993 there were around 1,400,000 Galicians abroad. If you compare this with the overall population in Galicia, which was in that year 2.3 million, you may understand how important migration was. They were distributed as follows: more than 500,000 in America and almost 300,000 of them in Argentina, 250,000 in EU countries plus Switzerland, and more than 500,000 residing in other Spanish autonomous communities, which is regions. Yet, in contrast with southern Italy, Poland, or other European sending countries. What we could label as the social and historical wound of migration in Galicia, the historical trace of Galicia, the historical memory of migration in Galicia, is far from being healed. More than 400 Galician recreational, social, cultural, and mutual aid associations still exist in America, Europe, and even Africa, and over 160 of them on the Americas. This strong persistence of individual and social links among Galicians residing abroad impacts the perception that the Galician population has about receiving countries. International events are often regarded from the perspective of their consequences on the Galician populations residing there. For instance, when the Argentine economic crisis reached its peak in December 2001, the Spanish media mainly expressed concern for the interests of Spanish investors and banks involved in basic sectors of the Argentine economy. However, in a country like Galicia, where every other family, one of two families, one of every second family, has close relatives living in Argentina, and more than 100,000 of them have been living in that country until recently, the main concern of public opinion was the pessimistic future prospects of the Argentine middle class, linked to the immediate, everyday problems of Galician migrants in that country. And these are not abstract concerns. This was the concern of Italian press regarding Argentina. Oh, the land of our grandparents, the land where the grandparents of our grandparents migrated to. This is like Chicago for Poles, for instance, or Minnesota for many Poles. No, it was a real concern. What happens to my uncle? What's going to happen to my cousins? Are they going to come? Are they going to come back here? Galician migration is the subject of active academic research and scientific debate, since migration, as I said, has become a key characteristic of Galician history that continuously affects its economic structure as well as its demographic and social profile. In Galicia, there is a real, though often diffuse, public debate over the place of migration in the collective identity of the country. The future of migration is also a controversial matter. Collective memory becomes a metaphor for history and satisfies a social demand. A people subject to continuous population movements since early modern times sees migration as one reason for its historical and cultural peculiarity. Galicians are often considered as archetypic migrants by outsiders. This image can have a pleasant face, such as the anecdote that Galicians are found everywhere, even on the moon, or that Christopher Columbus was Galician. Of course he was. But it also carries a negative side, where Galician migration is perceived as the outcome of extreme poverty, underdevelopment, isolation, and political clientelism. The social image of Galicians living abroad since the 17th century reflects this reality. In Madrid, in Lisbon, in Buenos Aires, or Sao Paulo, Galician immigrants were often described as ignorant, illiterate, and even silly workers who were only able to carry out hard, unskilled labor. Since the late 18th century, Galician intellectuals have fluctuated between an optimistic and a pessimistic view of migration. For the former, migration was the great hope for the country. New money and new men and women transformed by migration, could regenerate the country and lay the foundations for economic development. The idea that the uncles of America would return and bring money to the country and invest in new sectors and made Galicia a prosperous country. Others saw a collective failure interpreted from a catastrophic angle. The country had lost its best and most educated men, assuring a domination by local bosses and clergy due to the migration escape route for potentially opposing elements to the political system. The pessimistic view rests on a counterfactual hypothesis. No one can prove that socio-political change would have been accelerated and revolution, in inverted commas, would have occurred without migration. Much on the contrary, quite on the contrary, for social mobilizations, for starting social mobilization, resources are indispensable, and without material and immaterial resources, a society cannot generate a social movement, not even protest. So it can be also argued, and this would be my point, that migration provided Galicians, or many Galicians, with resources to start mobilization. The historical consequences of what really happened, mass migration, may be examined from diverse perspectives. One rather traditional school of Galician scholars focus on the analysis of demographic patterns, applying more or less implicitly neo-Malthusian models. This is the imbalance between a growing population and scarce resources. I mean, Malthus argued that population increase in a geometric way, while resources increase only in an arithmetical way. So the imbalance was unavoidable, and the only escape route was migration. Otherwise, famine and hunger would prevail, starvation would prevail in a poor society. Structural causes were the determining factors for a social exodus, independent on the will and decisions of the actors concerned, individual migrants. In contrast, a relatively new generation of scholars holds a more balanced and more nuanced view of the consequences of mass migration. There is no denying that migration weighed heavily on the demographic structure of the country, drastically reducing the younger age cohorts so that the absence of young men led to the overexploitation of female agricultural labor, or as a Galician poet put it, viuvas de vivos, I mean the widows of living men, the women who stayed in the country, particularly stayed on the farms, and had to look after the children and carry out hard work every day. But this is not necessarily a catastrophic phenomenon. Migration was the result of the migrants' decision within a context of limited opportunities, scarce possibilities of growth for traditional agriculture, and the lack of economic development in the secondary and the tertiary sector. But it was a decision, an individual decision. New approaches to the study of Galician migration have also highlighted the importance of increasing opportunities to migrate, to move, facilitated by information on job opportunities in the New World. If you have no information about job opportunities, you don't move. And the decreasing cost of transatlantic travel after the late 1880s due to the introduction of steamboats, these kind of boats. You remember the Titanic, right? The Titanic was typical steamboats for migrants with three classes. I mean, the first class full of boring people, and then the third class where Leonardo DiCaprio was dancing all the time, and then he met Kate Winslet, etc., etc. Well, it was not a reality. Not everyone met Kate Winslet or Leonardo DiCaprio. Yet, many new friendships were made at the boats because the trip to South America took around 3 weeks, the beginning of the 20th century. So you had a lot of time to spend with other people. The Galician peasantry's lack of comfort was perceived as a lack of opportunities to improve its living standards. The primary cause of migration was not absolute poverty, but rather the desire to improve their living conditions. To give you an example, the Brazilian government made continuous efforts to attract migrants as daily laborers for the coffee plantations around Sao Paulo since the late 19th century. Brazilian government paid the trip and forced migrants to work at the coffee plantations for at least 3 years under extremely hard working conditions. Many Poles were to Brazil thanks to this system, for instance. Yet, the Brazilian government always met little success in Galicia. Those who migrated were not the poorest members of peasant communities, but members of domestic groups of families that had the resources to finance a steamboat ticket to America. To put it another way, not everybody who wanted to migrate did migrate. Just those who had the chance to migrate did migrate. Not everybody can move. Not even Syrian refugees today in Europe belong to the poorest strata of Syrian society. They are educated people, they are professional, they are lawyers, they are doctors, they have resources to pay for the trip. Obviously, in relation to most Europeans, they are poor. But compared to those who stay at the country, they are seen as privileged. Those who migrated prefer to rely on private networks that link their parish with an Argentinian or a Brazilian district, thus offering a classical example of how chain migration operates at the micro level, which means chain migration. I go to America, I go to Chicago because my uncle is there and he's going to give me a job. And then I'm going to call my cousin, I'm going to call my neighbors just to join in because I'm working at that shop and this shop needs workforce. This is chain migration. This is how migration operates at the micro level. They basically were men who left alone, who were for the most part literate, more or less qualified in relative terms, and who intended to make some savings in a first phase. After this period, their wives and children or other relatives joined them in America. It could happen that they met another wife and they wrote to the remaining wife in Galicia, well, I'm not going to come back because I met an Italian girl or I met a Brazilian girl. This happened as well. I know some cases of this because migration is in itself an adventure and not everything can be planned in advance. The generalization of migrant social networks made it also possible for illiterate and even poorer peasants to join their relatives and neighbors in America as they offer them shelter and some facilities to get a job. The participation of women, of Galician women, in the migration flow increased since 1914, since the end of First World War, particularly In the case of migration towards Argentina, towards the urban economy of Buenos Aires. In 1916, women made up almost 23% of migrants, while in 1931 they already were 47% of all those who left Galicia. Migration networks could even remain asleep for long periods, as it happened between 1930, beginning of the Great Economic Crisis, the Great Depression, and 1946, end of Second World War, and then reawake and act as powerful means of transmission of information for future migrants, as well as a kind of bridgeheads that provided new immigrants with contracts, invitation letters, a shelter for the first day or weeks in the New World, and facilitated labor integration. Most Galician migrants were peasants, were overwhelmingly from peasant origins. Almost 95% of them came from the countryside. They were not the poorest peasants of the local societies. They usually belong to the middle strata of local peasantry. Yet, or paradoxically, as they arrived in America, they preferred to live in the big cities. Why did Galicians work preferably in the urban tertiary sector? Why did they become shopkeepers and not peasants or skilled artisans like the Italians, for instance? Perhaps because a majority of them thought of their migration as a temporary strategy and not as a definitive move, at least at the moment they left. The possibility of returning used to be a part of the horizon of values and expectations of Galician migrants. Just like the Poles. There is a fantastic work in English, I don't know whether you know of it, its existence, which is The Polish Peasant in Europe and America. There are 2 volumes of letters of Polish peasants to their relatives in America, which were compiled in 1918 by an American sociologist and a Polish anthropologist living in Chicago. And when I used these letters to explain Iberian Galician students how migration worked at the macro level, they don't even realize that the protagonists, that the actors are not Galicians, that they are Poles. They are Poles from northern Poland, they are Poles from eastern Poland, because the social logic, the social dynamics are the same, are very similar. Hence, it was clear that trying to get a job in the city was a much more rational strategy. You want to make some money, save money, and then come back. You don't buy a farm, you don't buy land. You prefer to stay at the town. Staying in the countryside and buying land meant, on the contrary, staying forever or almost forever in America. This is what, for instance, the Irish or the Italians or many Germans did, or many Jews in Argentina and Brazil. In America, a significant proportion of Galician immigrants got a job in the labor market of the tertiary urban sector. They occupied the unskilled or less skilled segments. Certainly there were rural settlers and farmers from Galicia who established themselves in the rural areas of Cuba, Argentina, or Brazil. However, they always represented a minority of rural Spanish settlers. Galicians were less represented among the coffee plantations laborers in Brazil than among urban semi-skilled workers and shopkeepers of Sao Paulo, for instance. There also were a lot of Galician sailors in the east coast of the United States, in the southern districts of Buenos Aires, or in the harbor of the Brazilian harbor of Santos. Even in Cuba, some recent research displays that there is much more diversity in the sectors of activity where Galicians were present than it was previously supposed. However, if an activity exists where Galician immigrants left a distinctive trace, also present in the popular images and stereotypes about Galicians in the Argentinian or Cuban public sphere, I'm trying here, for instance, Nini Marshall, who was an Argentine actress who portrayed in several films the role of a Galician maid. If there is a sector of activity where Galicians left a distinctive trace in Latin America, is urban trade, the tertiary sector, and small shops. Galicians were, for most Argentinians until very recently, shopkeepers. So Argentinians used to say, go to the Galician on the corner to buy some bread. It is a German who is very cheap. Galician migrants in America were particularly concentrated in the cities, and furthermore, in the large cities, in the metropolis. Galicians shape, for instance, around 10% of the total population of the city of Buenos Aires until the 1930s. The same happened in Montevideo or in some Brazilian towns. Galicians were to be found among shopkeepers, shop assistants, and clerks, as well as among street sweepers or tramway drivers. Just to show you some more pictures. Oh, it's not yet the end. There will be an end, but not yet. This is tailors. Once again, shopkeepers. Very typical Galician bar in Havana, etc. Starting from the hypothesis that migration is an individual decision made within a context of limited opportunities, we may reconstruct the frame of chances and macroeconomic and social processes that condition the individual's decision to migrate. I will establish 5 points. First, the existence of what could be called an economic discomfort, determined by the limitations of the growth expectations of the secondary and tertiary sector in the Galician economy until well advanced the 1960s, as well as on the constraints of an agricultural model based on small holding and cattle raising. People didn't migrate because they were poor. People migrate because their expectations could not be fulfilled within the Galician economy. You know, there are also always 2 poles, 2 extremes in the interpretation of migration. The first one considers migration to be a catastrophe. Migrants are pushed by a deus ex machina, by a kind of by structural factors, and have no influence on their lives. The other extreme, the other pole, consists of regarding migration almost as modern tourism. So migrants were people who took decisions, who went there, who came back. Well, I would say it's neither nor. People had the possibility, migrants had the chance of meeting decisions, of taking decisions, yet their opportunities were limited. Second, the existence of a consolidated tradition of mobility of the Galician population. manifesting the existence of several examples of short and medium distance migrant traditions in many Galician regions since the 17th century. Unskilled workers and laborers who migrated to the urban areas where they accumulated resources for jumping to another destination placed in the Iberian Peninsula, etc. Roof makers who traveled all around the Iberian Peninsula and even France, and who accumulated a certain experience of traveling, who had seen the world. This is not exclusive for Galicians. I mean, just to talk about Polish Galicia, it was quite a similar phenomenon. Poles, particularly Galician Poles and Ukrainians, were present, migrated as roof makers and seasonal laborers to southern Sweden since the 18th century, and it was the reason why they could then jump to America, because they accumulated resources and there was a tradition of mobility. Third, improvement of maritime transport between Europe and America. Going to America became cheaper and progressively faster and easier and more comfortable. To this could be added the propaganda campaigns driven by some Latin American governments, which dispose of a web of migration agents who publicize the advantages of the American destinations and made promises of a better living. Fourth, some push factors of socio-political nature have to be remembered. Obviously, there are political exiles as well. There are not only political exiles. The classic example for political exile in Spanish history and Galician history as well is the Spanish Civil War of 1936-39. Yet there were also other exiles, other examples of political expatriation, such as Republicans in the 19th century, and particularly an example which lay in the middle, which is that of migrants who preferred to migrate before they were called up for doing their military service in the colonial wars of Africa, particularly the Moroccan War, between 1907 and 1925. Avoiding conscription undoubtedly influenced their decision to advance the moment of departure. Fifth, as a consequence, the adventure of migration mostly was a safe adventure. The existence of migration chains of bridgeheads in the points of destination contribute to consolidate a dense and intricate web of microsocial networks that connected, for instance, small towns like Aguarda and Cedeira, very small towns, with Puerto Rico, the parish of Chaguazoso, which is today a village of counting 100 inhabitants, with Santiago de Chile, and the municipality of Ponte Calderas with the Brazilian town of Bahia. Just to give three examples. You have similar examples all over Europe. What does all that mean? In spite of its personal and familiar cause in terms of human suffering, in terms of nostalgia and homesickness, that I'm not underestimating, homesickness exists among migrants. Galician migration was not comparable, for instance, to the tragic example of the Irish migration, as many thousands of Irish migrants were forced to leave the country because of risking starvation and hunger after 1848. Galicians jumped to the New World, but at least until quite recently, they disposed of a net. They also had a safe shelter at home, the possibility to return to their rural farm or the hamlet in case of failure during the period of migration. This was something that most Andalusian seasonal laborers who left did not have, for instance, as they lacked any land property. So Andalusians migrated, sometimes by foot, to relatively closer urban areas such as Madrid or Barcelona. Galicians had the possibility to undertake long-distance mass migration. So Galicians were migrants because they were not as rich as many Europeans. But they also were able to migrate in the way they did because they were not as poor as many other Europeans. And this is perhaps a paradox of the history of Galician migration. In spite of the image of Galicia as a poor territory and region, and as a consequence of this as a migrant region, I have to say that Galicians migrated because they were not that poor. And this is because they had the chance to migrate. Within this general framework, Galicians migrated. Individuals and perhaps also families and domestic groups, when you are 15, you are 16, it's not always your decision. Well, today it's your decision, but at the beginning of the 20th century it was not your decision, it was your parents' decision. They were seduced by the fever of migration or not. They decided to follow the path opened by social networks or not. And hence they decided to embark on the adventure of migration or not. For the moment being, it is impossible for historical research to determine, to quantify how many left out of real hunger, how many left because of the wish to improve their living conditions, how many were motivated by the so-called lust of adventure, cobiza do longe, which was supposedly present in the so-called migrating Celts. It was a theory which was very popular in the 1920s and 1930s. Galicians were Celts, like the Irish, like the Scots, so they liked to migrate because they wanted to cross the ocean and they were eager for seeing new worlds. And how many simply wanted to escape conscription and avoid being sent to the African colonial war. A new generation of Galician social scientists seeks to reconstruct emigrants' experiences, memories, options, and choices. Sources neglected until recently, such as oral testimonies and particularly migrant letters, the letters written by emigrants, have now been published and re-examined. New approaches to the study of the socio-political activity of the Galician migrant communities in America uncover the extent to which migration brought new resources for collective action and technological change in rural and urban regions of Galicia. The network of Galician mutual aid associations in Havana, Buenos Aires, and Montevideo that peaked in the 1920s at over 500 had a significant impact on the socio-political dynamics of their parishes and municipalities of origin. They provided for resources for the land reform movements, the agrarian movement, which ran parallel to many other agrarian movements in East Central Europe, including Poland, as well as local weekly newspapers and politically articulated factions aimed at challenging the power of rural patrons. Emigrants sent home money, ideas, newspapers, and pamphlets, and those who returned, around 40-50% of all migrants until the 1930s, were to some extent new men forged by competing for a living, who value education and the need for mutual cooperation, and held little respect for traditional rural elites. They were, returned migrants were often portrayed as ignorant, new rich men, always carrying, this white hat, which is the so-called Cuban hat, are always carrying a parrot at the hand, and trying to. These are real pictures of so-called habaneros, returnees from Havana, always presenting themselves as more advanced men, or returnees from Venezuela in the 1960s, always driving big cars, big American cars. But this was just one side of the returnees' individual and collective action, and collective agency. Social mobilization in the Galician countryside during the first third of the 20th century may be regarded as an unexpected outcome of migration, which clearly helped spread new ideas in rural parishes and hamlets. Likewise, migrants financed public utilities throughout rural Galicia. Almost 300 primary schools. Here you have some examples of primary schools who were financed by Galicians abroad. Before the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, certainly a great percentage of the returnees and immigrants' remittances of the money they sent home was invested in sheer financial speculation, as well as in luxury goods, in building a real big house. However, it has to be noted that many innovative entrepreneurs who attempted at developing new industries and accepted risking in new sectors of activity had a migratory background. This consequence of mass migration operated at the level of collective action and has to be added to the most frequently studied, the best known impact of exodus on the home country. This is the amount and destinations of money remittances, which operated at a family level. In Galicia, as in other European regions, savings earned in America, money earned in America, was invested in buying land, allowing smallholding peasants access to full property. Thus, migration helped consolidating small property holdings during the pre-Civil War period. It could be said that mass migration did not seem to have generated a massive failure. The literary image of mass migration insists on migration as a great failure. However, historical evidence questions that image. On the contrary, for most migrants, transatlantic migration represented quite a significant social success, at least considered from a comparative perspective. Just a minority of migrants became millionaires. Not everyone became Rockefeller. Perhaps a significant minority returned home with no savings at all, and another significant minority experienced poverty in the countries of destination. But for the bulk of Galician migrants, social success meant becoming landowner, shopkeeper, skilled worker, civil servant, or merchant in the New World and in Europe, and hence to fulfill the career expectations of a small-holding peasant. Your social expectations depends heavily on your social background. It can be affirmed that most people who left, at least before 1930, intended to return home after some years, to invest their savings in the place of origin, improve their farm, or rebuild their house. Not everyone could return, but those who returned managed, in the relative majority, to improve their rural exploitations, to live off manual work, to establish themselves in the towns, and set up a shop or even build houses. So, what were the effects of transatlantic migration? On the socio-political level, transatlantic migration also had a certain impact on the origins and development of the Galician ethno-nationalist movement. It is difficult to evaluate the extent to which mass migration affected. I'm just looking for another picture. Just one example of a public utility financed by Americans. The extent to which mass migration affected the recovery of Galician culture and language after the mid-19th century, or whether migration accelerated the process of linguistic assimilation of Galician-speaking peasants who went in large numbers to Spanish-speaking countries and eventually returned to Galicia using Castilian as a vehicular language instead of Galician. Here, pessimistic and optimistic views again confront each other. For pessimists, mass migration to Spanish-speaking countries diminished the number of Galician-speaking people, or diminished the figures of Galician speakers, since linguistic assimilation was accelerating in Latin America, and returnees tended to introduce Creole Spanish into rural settings. A couple of American words exist today in Galician. For others, however, this effect was counterbalanced by the fact that many Galician writers, periodicals, and political groups emerged among the migrant communities in Argentina, Cuba, and Uruguay, waving the banner of Galician regionalism and after 1920 of Galician ethno-nationalism. In fact, in the 1930s, ethno-nationalist groups enjoyed a broader audience among the Galician migrants of Buenos Aires than in Galician. A significant number of leaders favoring autonomy, home rule, and even independence in the 1920s and 1930s turned into regional activists after migrating to Buenos Aires or to Havana. So, to put it other way around, many people sustain that people are less nationalistic, are less patriotic when they travel and they meet another cultures. But actually, it happened the other way around. Many people became patriots when having to confront themselves with other cultures and with other examples. And the same happened to many Poles, to many Slovaks, to many Lithuanians in America as well. So they rediscover their country of origin and reconceive or rebuild the image of the country after being abroad. This also has to do with another factor. This is from the 1870s. There was in America an immigrant elite from Galician origin, made of successful merchants, entrepreneurs, and members of the liberal professions, who experienced a great success and enjoyed an increase in popularity in Argentina, Uruguay, or Cuba. This elite aimed at recreating Galicia and sometimes also a better Spain in the new Latin American republics, particularly in dynamic urban centers like Buenos Aires. This elite was joined by new arrivals, lawyers, journalists, artists, until the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. There were socialists and anarchist expatriates, as well as Republicans and, since the 1920s, ethno-nationalists. They played the card of taking over the ethnic leadership of the Galician migrant community, shaped a political and cultural program for the whole, and dreamed of a renovation of Galicia and or Spain. And their initiative was behind the foundation of journals for the migrants, mutual aid associations, leisure centers, and small-scale associations that gather those migrants who share a similar origin. They aim at sending money to their fellow countrymen in Galicia to foster education, technological innovation, and social and political mobilization, as well as contribute to the spread of civil society in their areas of origin. They intended to regenerate Galicia, and therefore the powerfully articulated immigrant communities of Buenos Aires, Havana, and Montevideo were often regarded with envy from Galician elites and social movements in Galicia, who sometimes considered the so-called Galician Americans to be authentic examples to follow, when not the real promoters of Galicia's redemption. More than 600 Galician associations in America before 1936 became, in some respects, although the real importance was often idealized and exaggerated, a model of organization of civil society. Galicians, it was said, were also able, when they migrated, to shape an autonomous civil society and create by themselves all resources that did not come from the state. And this was a positive lesson of migration. Well, to conclude, if there are questions, I am eager to reply to them. To conclude, yes, two basic points. First, small countries which had no big cities, no big towns, which had no big names to show off in the world, used to, and which had experience, or which have experienced mass migration, used to present themselves in the world as diasporic communities, because they make them appear bigger as they are. An example are the Armenians, another examples are Estonians, and good examples are Portuguese as well. Galicians are a perfect example of diasporic imagination. Most Galicians want to present the country as a country of migrants composed not only of a hardcore, not only of an ethnic core, but also made of many migrant communities which exist all over the world. This is perhaps one of the reasons why the Galician culture abroad has still stirs up, still awakes certain interest. Second, a paradoxical consequence of this is that both the fact that Galicia has also become a country of immigration since the 1990s, and the fact that Galicia experiences since the end of the 20th century a new wave of migration which is completely different from the old one, are regarded by Galician public opinions under or from the perspective of being a traditional migrant society. Thus, Galician society has tended to be much more tolerant towards newcomers, towards new immigrants, because they still remember that Galicia until the 1970s was the land of mass migration. I have mentioned post-war migration, but the figures of post-war migration are also great. And second, today, or present-day Galician migration, which is mainly composed of younger, qualified, skilled workers and even university graduates who are obviously unsatisfied with present-day labor conditions in Spain, and particularly with unemployment, are usually presented as a continuation of the past exodus. However, present-day Galician migrants are completely different. In the past, Galicia exported unskilled workers and imported talented, qualified workers. Today, it happens the other way around. We are exporting qualified workers, we are exporting talented university degrees, university graduates, and we are importing unskilled workers. So actually, the picture differs from the past, yet the diasporic imagination still persists. So, dear Kuyen, thank you very much. And now, and open for your questions if you have any. I know it's quite late.
We invite you to ask questions or share your reflections. Want anyone to speak?
Qué pena que esto no fue en español, pero fue muy bueno.
I was asked to give the lecture in English, so next time
Well, do you want to ask some questions, some more questions? Yes.
I wanted to ask, what was the total population of Galicia in these times? Because as I've seen it, when we are talking about 1.5 million of people who emigrated, how many were left then?
Well, statistics, as I said, are imprecise, but we may estimate that the flow, I mean, I just gave aggregated figures, right? So you have to take into account that these aggregated figures don't mean that 1.5 million people migrated at the same time. So, but we may estimate that around 10% of the Galician overall population migrated, which is quite a lot. But it depended, it had fluctuations depending over time, and we don't really know how many of those who left return, which is one of the main problems, because many of them were seasonal laborers. Even in Argentina, there were these seasonal laborers. There were people who crossed the ocean, who worked for 3-4 months in the Argentinian farms, and they returned to Galicia. And they did that because wages are so good, or the wages were so good that they could afford for that.
Is there anyone more who wants to speak or to ask some question?
Questions maybe asking Polish and then
yes, if you prefer,
in Spanish,
yes, you can speak in Polish, in Spanish, in Galician,
in German.
Well, probably we need some more time to for reflection, but for now.
Yeah.
I want to ask about this image of Galician as negative immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
Is it only the thing of the past, or is it still somehow in the world?
Well, that's a good question. It's complicated to answer. Obviously, stereotypes have been forged in the past, but stereotypes are much more persistent than social change. So negative stereotypes tend to overlap with new realities, and new realities are sometimes regarded in the light of all stereotypes. So the social image of Galicians in Argentina, Cuba, Mexico, and the whole of Latin America was forged between the 18th century and the 20th century, and it was a mixture of early modern negative stereotype on the one hand, and the new realities introduced by immigration on the other hand. To put it simply, Galicians were in the 18th century, Galicians, not only Galicians, but Galicians in particular, were portrayed at the Spanish court as illiterate, as rude, as people who didn't speak properly Spanish, etc. This image was transplanted to the Americas in the colonial period. The pro-independence movements also exploited this negative image. Galicians meant royalist Spaniards. I mean, those who were in favor of the Spanish monarchy at the beginning of the 19th century. And they considered that labeling all of them as Galicians was an offense. And to this, the fact that many Galicians occupied unskilled positions in the labor market of urban economies in the 19th and 20th centuries actually nurture this stereotype, and also introduce a number of variegated nuances. To give you an example, the Galician maid. I mean, the example of the Galician maid in Argentina is the Irish maid in the United States. It's exactly the same. Yeah, I think a mixture of sexual initiation for younger bourgeois people and lack of experience in domestic work, etc. And lack of morale, but at the same time they were simply quite reliable people because they were too ignorant to be thieves. They were too ignorant to be mafiosi, to put it simply. This was the image. And this image still persists. I mean, I guess I have here no access to internet, but I could show you some publicity spots by Argentinian companies, particularly by a beer company which is quite famous in Argentina, Quilmes, which date back to the beginning of the 21st century. They still portrayed Galician waiters as being particularly rude. It is interesting because they present a mixture of, it is an Argentinian couple who go to Paris, and this Argentinian couple, I mean, the man wants to obviously show off and says, well, I can't speak French, don't worry, when the waiter comes, I'm going to talk to him in French. What do you want? I mean, his French obviously was quite limited. He said, garçon, potato, please. And the garçon then was a Galician. I say, there's no potato, there's pulpa feira. And then some dancers playing flamenco appear on the scenario, which is a complete contradiction. But it is the only country, I mean, Latin America is the only country where if you want to portray Spaniards in a negative way, you portray them as Galicians and not as bullfighters and not as flamenco dancers. I mean, this still persists in a very diluted, in a very bad way, but it still persists. But it is, you go to certain urban centers of the United States, for instance, to Pittsburgh, and you talk to people from Irish origin, they make jokes about Poles, because Irish and Poles were the two rival ethnic groups within the United States, because both were unskilled laborers, both were unskilled workers, and both were very Catholic. So both went to the Catholic parishes, and there was a rivalry which was fueled by Polish and Irish priests. So And obviously, these stereotypes have today no real background, no real social backgrounds. I mean, people who make jokes about Poles in Pittsburgh don't know anything about present-day Poland. They talk about jokes about Poles of the past.
What an interesting answer. There is someone else who wants to speak or share his reflection. So I thank you very much once again for the great lecture. And I also want to thank the audience for the warm reception of our guest. And I think we could end our meeting. Thank you.